Well, for nearly 2 years now, a special citizen task force has been working to identify possible solutions for a whole range of infrastructure problems on North Beach, most notably the lack of adequate drainage. Now that the City Council has cleared the way for a new canal-based development on North Beach aimed at addressing that drainage problem, some say the work of the task force is done. Mayor Joe McComb sent out a letter thanking the members, but not everyone agrees the work is done. Our Brian Burns has the update.
In the letter, the mayor thanked all of the task force members for completing the job that they signed up for.
In April of 2018, a task force was created to address infrastructure problems on North Beach, mainly an ongoing drainage and other problems that were having a negative impact on development, like streets and sidewalks. The work of the task force ended in December when council approved their recommendation to allow a navigable waterway to be built, which would aid in fixing the drainage problems. That waterway is part of a planned development that would see a major multi-million-dollar project built alongside the canal. Mayor Joe McComb wrote, the letter was to provide members with a final update and closure for their work.
And so their job was complete. And so I was sending them a thank you letter saying that's closure and that we appreciate your efforts. But like I said, never in my wildest dreams did I think a thank you letter would create a kerfuffle.
McComb says the council will continue to work on North Beach infrastructure until funding and permits for the canals are obtained. He says council expected the task force to take 6 months, but ended up finishing almost a year and a half later. But task force chair and former council member Carolyn Vaughn does not agree.
North Beach needs to be represented. They need to have someone that is constantly looking at what's going on at North Beach. I unfortunately don't trust the government to do it themselves.
Vaughn says the task force produced 54 recommendations for infrastructure problems, and there's also much more to be done on North Beach.
North Beach residents hope the council doesn't forget them. From North Beach, Brian Burns, 3 News.